showing you, not. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Nikki Lynham, and welcome to this webinar on using collaborative math teams in the math classroom. I am a teacher in the Greater Victoria School District, as well as co-founder of Educating Now. So just a little bit of information about myself is I have been looking at exploring different ways of teaching math for the past 9 years because I wanted to make math more engaging for the students, certainly more understandable and more enjoyable. And the way that I have found to do that best is through developing conceptual understanding and really to allow students to become active participants in their learning, which is really different from the traditional way that we've taught math very procedurally. So these collaborative math teams have combined all of the work that I've been doing in terms of using manipulatives and digging into that conceptual understanding and using language and partner talk, and it's just brought it to a whole new level. It took me a couple of years of lots of trial and error to figure out how to get these teams working really effectively, but in the last school year, we finally figured it out, and I had the opportunity to collaborate with many of my colleagues, and I feel like we are at a place now we're ready to share what we've learned. So that's what this webinar is about. It's really an introduction to how we use the teams. If you are interested in learning more, we are offering a course on Educating Now on how to use the math teams in far more detail, and I'll be referring to that throughout the webinar. So with no further ado, we will get started. Actually, there's one more thing. We're going to try something new for today's webinar, in that you can ask questions. I've got Hugo and Lou with me. And they will be able to moderate your questions and ask me along the way. So if you have questions throughout, please don't hesitate to ask, as well as I'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers if you would prefer to wait until then. And you can follow me on Twitter at Nikki Lynham. Okay, let's get started. So that's a little bit about me. You'll see that. You can read that further when you get your email. So let's look at what we're going to be talking about today. So for this webinar, looking at the benefits of using collaborative math teams, both for the students and the teachers, and how to set up the teams so that every student is engaged and accountable. We're going to look at some specific examples of tasks and how the student teams worked with them. I'll be using an example from a grade 8 class that I worked in this year. And when and how to use direct instruction for whole class or team intervention. So this is where we really will talk about teacher agility and how to know when to adjust depending on what's happening in your class. And looking at how the teams helps to differentiate to meet more of your learners' needs. So I've just been told that my slides aren't up, so I'm going to try that again. Bear with me. This is my second ever webinar. So hopefully now you are seeing that outline. Okay, so let's talk first about student engagement. The very first thing that every single teacher that I tried this method of teaching with said was that the student engagement went through the roof, especially those students that generally disengage, the ones that opt out. So those, you know, the students I'm talking about, the ones that hide, they put their head down, they pretend like they're paying attention or doing what they're supposed to be doing, but they're really not engaging in the learning at all. So this way of teaching the math really engaged those students. It engaged all the students. It also really helped with the behavior students. It engaged them in the learning and didn't really allow for the opportunities for misbehavior. What I noticed, as I observed in the different classroom, was huge improvement in problem-solving skills, critical thinking, their communication, and the way in which they were collaborating and working together. I also love to see, and this took a little while, was to see some more creativity in the math class where students were taking risks and trying different methods, even if they didn't work out for them, but they were at least trying out things. And the communication one especially, there was a teacher that came to observe the classroom that we were working with our math teams in, and that was the one thing that stood out to him the most. He was absolutely blown away by the ability of the students to communicate their mathematical thinking. So hopefully you will see those same benefits. Another thing that I heard, especially from the students, and again, more so from our traditionally struggling learners, was that they were less frustrated because they didn't have to wait for help. So if you have had any experiences like I've had in the past, math class can be an exhausting race in which you give the students their task, maybe it's a worksheet, a problem, anything, and you usually have a handful of students that have their hand up before you can even get started. And so you're rushing around trying to get them, you know, getting going and giving them what they need in order to just get started. And before you can even get through helping those kids, you will have another handful of kids that are done. And you just are in this endless loop of trying to meet all their needs, but because they have there's such a huge variety of needs in any one classroom, and there's one of you and 30 of them, it seems like a mission impossible. And this is where the teams really, really helped, was it eliminated all of those startup questions because the students could get the help they needed from their peers right away and as often as they needed. I also strongly believe that the biggest problem with teaching traditionally when we've taught math is that we've really focused only on the procedural knowledge, and we've missed out on looking at mathematics as a whole. And really, I think the most important thing is to develop conceptual understanding, because if they have conceptual understanding, they can create a procedure. If they only have a procedure, then they're lost if that procedure is forgotten. If they don't have the conceptual understanding, they have nowhere to go. So I like this little diagram because it you know, connects all of the different pieces. And in our math teams, we were absolutely using all of these pieces. So we had our concrete manipulatives, we used models and pictures, grids. We were definitely using symbols, those are our number models, and the entire time talking through and putting it into context if it was a more abstract problem, and understanding it in context if it already was in context. Here are some student testimonials. So this first one is from a student who was quite a struggling learner, and he improved significantly. And he said that hearing other people's concepts and ideas helped him to understand. The next one is actually from a student on the opposite end. She was quite a strong student, and I love what she said here. She said, "I think it built a better understanding for me by explaining it to my group in different ways and helping them understand." So Olivia had very strong procedural knowledge, and her challenge was to think about and understand and learn really the math in a different way, because oftentimes the procedures that she tried to explain to her peers didn't make sense to them. So she had to come up with other ways and visuals in order to help her teammates develop their understanding. So she benefited as much, if not more, than even the struggling learners in her group. Kylie says, "I can learn the same thing in multiple different ways because my classmates and I all do things differently. Also, if I don't understand someone's explanation, I can try and understand someone else's." This actually really surprised me, how many of the students, when we asked for feedback, said how much they liked looking at it in multiple ways. They thought it was really interesting that you could solve the same problem in many different ways. Cayman said, "It helped me to see different ways of doing the questions. Also, it made me think and understand different ways of thinking mathematically." And he was a pretty strong student to start with. So again, what really challenged him especially was having to incorporate visuals into the responses. And Kyla said, "I liked groups because if I don't understand how the teacher teaches, I can ask my group members." And I think this really, it hits on something that I've been saying to kids for years, which is they often can explain things to each other in ways that make more sense to their brains than us as teachers. So this enables them to learn from each other and to teach each other in a really powerful way. We asked this grade 8 class after about 2 months of working with their math teams, we asked them which method they would prefer, if they wanted to continue going with the teams or if they wanted to go back to the more traditional teacher-directed style. Now, when I say traditional, I don't mean procedural. I mean, we're still using manipulatives and models, but it was definitely more teacher-directed. So we would, the teachers and I would lead the class, and the students would work through, and we'd use our whiteboards and really move through as one whole group, and then they would break off and work in pairs throughout those lessons as well. And as you'll hear as we go forward, we weren't using that style at all. So we were hardly giving them any methods unless it was necessary. And I'll come back to that. 100%, every single student in that class said that they would prefer the groups. And only one student actually chose both. And that was because she really did not like to talk out loud in front of her peers. I personally thought it was great that she was in the groups because it helped her to come out of her shell a little bit. So moving on to the benefits for you as a teacher, the biggest benefit I can see is that you'll have more time to formatively assess your students and support the learning as it's happening. So again, if we look back at kind of a more traditional model, you might be collecting in homework, and there's too much time between when you see where your students are at and your ability to help them and correct misunderstandings. Using these teams does all of that in real time right away. So it's much more effective. And the teachers also told me they were inspired. They found this an extremely powerful way of teaching, and they were a lot less exhausted at the end of lessons because they weren't doing that run around race that I was describing earlier. This is some feedback from Dom, who's a grade 6 teacher, and he's one of the first teachers that I partnered with. So we definitely had a lot of trial and error learning together. He said that it was the kids driving the process. They were driving their learning in a very collaborative way. It empowers the kids, it's student-centered, they're communicating their understanding at a far greater level than just me at the front of the class, just choosing students. So again, I just want to hit on that. You know, when we teach, we often will call on those kids, often the ones that have their hands up. And even if we do structured partner talk, we're still only hearing from a sampling. Whereas when we use these teams, all of the kids are required to be talking and learning and engaged in the math. So you definitely get a lot more engagement. And Darlene is a grade 8 teacher, and she said that collaborative math teams has changed my practice. I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I'm going to do this method of teaching for all my units. And she teaches other subjects other than math, so she's planning on using this style for her humanities classes as well, because it just worked so well. And the other thing she noticed was it created this really beautifully supportive, positive culture in her class that spread way beyond the math classroom. She said that she didn't see the kids frustrated. She was certainly a lot less tired, and she felt like she was giving them what they needed as they needed it more effectively than she had in the past. Okay, so let's talk about how to get started. Just as a general overview here, you're going to carefully plan your teams. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. You will definitely need to be prepared to spend a few lessons laying out expectations. So the beginning of this process is very slow, and there were many teachers that I worked with where they started to freak out a little bit because they were worried about covering their curriculum. And what happened was we went very slow at the beginning. It's that old adage of slow down to speed up. And the students took quite some time to solve the problems. But after a few weeks, they were solving the problems faster than I could have imagined, and really efficiently, and still understanding them conceptually. So you will gain that time back, but it is necessary to really lay a strong foundation. And part of that is the process of reflecting and providing feedback on your expectations, both for problem solving and also for collaborative work. So I based this off of complex instruction, which isn't as complex as the name infers, but I learned about it in Joe Bowler's book called Mathematical Mindsets. At the end here, I'm going to share a couple of books that I used for these collaborative math teams that I used the most. And there's lots on the internet if you want to just Google complex instruction. It really goes through how it was developed and how to use it. So essentially, I chose four students per team. Now, Dom liked to have more students. He liked to have 5 or 6 because then they sort of broke into subgroups. So by no means do you only need to have 4, but I found that was the most effective, was the 4 students. And this part is crucial. The teams are mixed ability and they're mixed skills. So we do not want to be grouping what you would consider your high achievers together and so on. This is not a way of streaming. It's actually the polar opposite. And the most amazing thing about this is when we group them this way and we structure it the way that we do, the achievement gap starts to close. So those students that are struggling improve, and the ones that are already doing well continue to perform well. The very best way that I saw that created, I think, the best groups was what we did was we chose one student for each group that was a strong communicator. We chose one student for each group that we felt had strong procedural skills in math, and one student for each group that we thought was strong conceptually in math. And then the fourth member was someone that hadn't really shown us a strength in any of those areas yet. So that way, it helped to keep the groups talking, and because there was different strengths with the procedures and the conceptual understanding, it just worked really, really well. Each member has a role with specific responsibilities. So again, in the course that we've created on Educating Now, it goes into far more detail with this, and in both of the books that I'm going to share with you, they go into this as well. We created the roles and it changed. So the kids in the grade 6 classrooms had different roles than the ones in grade 8s. And the teachers and I specifically sat down and collaborated on what those roles were going to look like. So you can choose any roles you want, but you can use the templates that we've created. This part is crucial. Each member is accountable for their own and each other's learning. And this is how we avoid that pitfall of group work where you get one or two students that are doing all the work and the others that are just sort of along for the ride. Because we're holding them all accountable, they know that each other's learning is as important as their own. And how we do that is we go around and we sort of do random checks. And you can ask any person in the group how they've come to their solution. And if they can't tell you, then you let the group know they haven't actually met your expectations for collaboration yet. So as we move forward, we've set our groups. Now we're going to look at building that math culture. And this is crucial for having these teams run well. And part of how we do that is we co-create criteria. And I spent one whole class on co-creating criteria for problem solving and another whole class on co-creating for collaborative learning. And again, I have templates that I'll share with you in our course, and they're both found in the books that I'll be sharing with you. So we really need the students to be partners, and they're the ones that are learning. They should be the drivers. And so we want them to be a part of this co-creation of the criteria, especially for the collaborative learning, because they need to give their input as to what works for them as a learner and what needs they have in terms of working with their peers. Another aspect that is super important in building a math culture, I think it actually might be the most important, and I could do an entire webinar just on this, is the growth mindset. If you have not heard of growth and fixed mindset, I really encourage you to check it out. Carol Dweck from Stanford is the professor that really started the research and has written a book on this, and there are a ton of online resources for free. This is not just important for math, it is important for all learning, and it's really important for us as teachers because we
Nikki, I'm going to pause you right there. We've got a question from one of our viewers. It is for setting up classrooms at the beginning of the year. How do you effectively set up groups before you've seen their strengths? Or do you wait to start math groups?
I would definitely wait a little bit to start math groups. I mean, you could go in blind and just sort of guess at it, but I would, the math groups require a lot of courage because they're going to be vulnerable. So I wouldn't start right at the first day. I would give a couple of weeks where maybe you do some structured partner talk, and as you're reviewing sort of your basic numeracy and number sense, you will start to understand who has those strengths. So back to our growth mindset, I love this image. I got it off Pinterest, and in the white you can see sort of a fixed mindset. So on the example on the left here, I'm not good at this. And a growth mindset student would say, what am I missing? So fixed mindset would say, I made a mistake. Growth mindset, mistakes help me to improve. And I will tell you that for the past 9 years that I've been teaching more conceptually and using best practices, there were always a few students that just weren't learning. And it was this big mystery for me that I was absolutely bent on figuring out why. And this was the missing puzzle piece. Students who have a fixed mindset, their brains physiologically work differently. from students with a growth mindset. And the more research we have, and the neuroscience is improving, and it's growing every day. We've learned a lot even in the last 2 years, has shown us that these mindsets have way more of an effect on success and achievement than inherent talent or anything that you're born with. So again, if you don't know anything about fixed and growth mindset, please go check it out. Here's another image that I like. So in the growth mindset and the fixed mindset, there are phrases that would, indicate someone with a growth or a fixed mindset. And I love that, the one up on top of growth mindset. Failure is an opportunity to grow. I think in math especially, people view failure as, well, it's wrong. It's something to be ashamed of or to be embarrassed of. And for some reason, math is also the most overassessed subject, and it's become a performance subject. So students know that every time they get a question wrong, they're penalized and their grade goes down. So we need to give them opportunities for penalty-free practice so that they actually have the opportunity to learn and they're not just performing. The performance comes, but it's not an entire performance all the way through. There needs to be the chance for making mistakes and figuring out those misunderstandings. So that growth mindset is really crucial in building that math culture, as is, again, how we look at mistakes. I love this. Mistakes allow thinking to happen. So 2 things that I really help my students to reframe are mistakes and not being embarrassed. And they're actually something to be celebrated because we can all learn from them. And by the way, the brain grows twice as much when it makes a mistake than if it does something correctly. So when a student makes a mistake, I say, awesome, you just got smarter. Now let's figure this out. And the second thing that I like to reframe with my students is struggle. It's not a bad thing. It actually is important, because without great struggle, we won't get great learning. Okay, next, as we're moving into working with the math, we need to clearly communicate the learning goals. And this isn't just for math teams, this is just good teaching. So we want to have a clear learning goal. It needs to be written so that the students know exactly what they're expected to do. And we have that success criteria. So you can see this one, and that's why I chose it, was we're looking for more than just the right answer. And in the case of the math groups that I did, the success criteria came in the form of the problem solving criteria. And they know that they had to include a visual. They had to show multiple different ways of solving. They had to have an in-context problem. They had to be able to explain it in words. And they had to describe any connections that they made between this and either their life or past topics or anything else that they could relate it to. So those learning goals are crucial for students, because otherwise, how are they supposed to know where they're going? What I loved about these math teams is it was a really nice blend of discovery learning and more teacher-directed learning. So I think the discovery learning is so important. And the research tells us that if we give students a problem before we've taught them the method in math, how to actually solve the problem, they learn the actual method better. So that's what we were utilizing with these problems. We gave the students the problems without teaching them the concept. We made sure we accessed their prior knowledge, and we knew that they were ready for the new learning because we ensured that they had that prior knowledge before we moved on to it. But we didn't teach them. We didn't get up there and show them how to do it and give worked examples. We let them, with hands-on materials and visuals and in their teams, problem solve authentically. They actually didn't know how to solve the problem, and they had to figure it out. And what this does is it emphasizes the process, and the failures just encourage more learning, because they haven't been given something that they're practicing, and if they do it wrong, it's indicative of a failure. They're actually just learning how to figure it out for themselves. And if you look at the traditional learning, it's knowledge transfer. That's not what we're looking at here. And the emphasis is on the result, and failures is frowned upon. So we're moving away from that and into something a little bit more towards the discovery learning. I also love this image because, again, there's such a stereotype in math that it's all about calculating and about procedures. And it's not. When we look at mathematical problem solving, the attitudes are crucial, and that comes back to that growth mindset that I discussed earlier. The metacognition, that's the reflection and the feedback and the goal settings that we're doing. The processes are the competencies, the skill sets that students need to have in life, not just for math, but for being successful in their jobs. The concepts, and I like that it's on the bottom because to me it's like the root. The conceptual understanding is crucial, and the skills are your math skills, and they absolutely need to be a part of problem solving, but they're not the only aspect to problem solving. Okay, we're going to move along into choosing the right types of tasks or problems. Now, this was where I experienced the most error in terms of trial and error. So the way I started, now I actually did not use anything that's traditional. This is just an example of the extreme, but the teachers and I did collaborate, and we created worksheets that had multiple different problems, but they were worksheets that were really trying to dig into conceptual understanding. So they used models, and they had students using manipulatives, they had open tasks. However, just the fact that we gave them a worksheet with multiple questions, we ended up with something like this. So they basically were all working individually, but in a group. They were sitting together, but they weren't actually working together. And the only benefit to the group at this point was they could ask each other a question, or, you know, if they wanted to make sure they were getting the right answer. And Dom actually overcame this by when he gave them the worksheet, and they were tasked with only doing one question at a time, and every single student had to understand each question and be able to explain it. But what he did was he actually refused to allow them to have a pencil for the first 5 minutes. So they had to just discuss. So they had to reread the problem, make sure everyone understood it, discuss, etc., before they even picked up the pencil to get started on the worksheet. And that, you know, was more successful for sure, but it definitely was difficult to untrain them from what they're used to, because they're so used to in math class getting worksheets and just plowing through them. So when we asked them not to do it that way, it was super challenging. So when I was working in the grade 8 class, we tried something totally different, and it was far more successful. So here's an example. This was the first problem we gave them when we were looking at percentage. And this is a grade 8 class, so we're supposed to be looking at more than 100% or less than 1. But this was our pre-assessment, essentially, to see what they had remembered or what they knew about finding percentages of numbers from the previous year, from grade 7. And what I love about this question, this comes from Dan Mayer's blog, is you can see the question is, which coupon should I use? And there is no answer at this point. So we've given them a problem, but we haven't even given them enough information. And that is deliberate, because we want them to figure out, well, wait a minute, it depends, and I need more information. And what information do I need? So the right type of problems are challenging enough that they won't solve it in a few minutes. So if you just choose a question that they know immediately how to do, and then they just spend the time calculating, or they can figure it out super quickly, it's not challenging enough. And we want questions that allow for multiple perspectives, approaches, and representations. So more open, more vague questions. When I say open, I mean questions that have more than one right answer. And Dan Mayer has a ton of great problems on his blog. It is all aligned with the core curriculum, so different from I'm in Canada, so I definitely had to look through, and it didn't match up with the grades, but I found problems that suited the concepts for our grades, no problem. Joe Bowler's website, UCubed, has a ton. So does the book Mathematical Mindsets, and Robert Kaplinsky has good problems on there that have some nice visuals, as well as Open Middle. So those are all the free websites that I used, and as well as some of the other resources. I also really like the Math Makes Sense questions, especially when you look at the ones towards the end of any given chapter or unit, because they tend to be more open and more complex. And what you could do is take a textbook question and just alter it to make it a little bit more open, or a little bit less prescriptive. So maybe take out some of the information, and then the students would have to come and ask for that information. The other thing that makes it a good problem is that they're actually engaging their math reasoning skills to solve it, because because we're not giving them the method right away, they're not just practicing something you've taught them, they're trying to discover it for themselves. So the first thing I always do is I get the students to make predictions. So back to the problem that I gave them, what's the better deal, basically, $20 off or 20% off? And I asked them to make predictions on that. And that was very interesting because you had some students that were like, I have no idea. They didn't really understand what percent meant. Many of them kind of knew already that there wasn't enough information. They said, well, it depends. And so they already identified what further information they need. And one of the roles, just so you know, and again, all of this is in far more detail in our course. One of the roles that we had was the resource facilitator. And part of that role is that they are the only person in the team that's allowed to ask the teacher for help. So they have to make sure that no one else in their team can answer the question, and they're the only ones allowed to ask for help. And what that does is it frees up so much of your time, because they often don't need to actually ask for help very often at all, which means you can go around and do that formative assessment and work one-on-one with groups or individuals. So we next move into accessing prior knowledge. We've made our prediction. I want the students to generalize based on what they know about percentages. So I pushed them a little bit further. They said, well, it depends whether you would choose the 20% or $20 off. And I wanted them to articulate, it depends on what. And now I asked them, use what you know about percentages to solve the problem. And I did give them grids. They had access to base 10 blocks. And I let them go at it. And they struggled. Now, this is where this is one part of complex instruction as well that absolutely must be done. When we didn't do this, we did not have nearly as good of lessons. And this is painful. I will tell you that right now. I actually had to set a timer on my phone because I kept forgetting to do this. But every 5 to 10 minutes, check in and ask the students to reflect on their group learning process. And what you do is you highlight good practices. So I would go around and I would check, I would listen. And if I heard a student say to their team, oh, how did you do that? I don't get that. That is one of the kids I would give a shout out to. And I would say that is what we're talking about when we look at effective collaboration, because it takes a lot of courage to speak up in front of your peers, especially at the age group I'm working with, which was grades 6, 7, and 8. Takes a lot of courage to do that. So we want to highlight that. I also highlight groups that I can see are physically huddled. You can see from afar that each member is totally actively engaged. So as we work through this, we highlight all those positives over and over again until they start to develop a really clear understanding of those expectations. So I'm not highlighting any negative examples. I'm not even commenting on those. I empathize when students are struggling and are frustrated, because they absolutely will be at the beginning. And that's why I love this learning process, because they're developing way more than math skills here. They're developing all of those, I call them the 4 C's, right? They're your communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. So back to the problem. So we had originally started with which coupon should I use? Now in Dan Mayer's blog, he goes through, or this isn't on his blog, it's his 3-act test bank. And he gives different prices. So some of the items were really inexpensive. They might be a toy that's, $12 to $20. Some were quite expensive. This was the first one I gave the students. So it was a chair. It cost $139.99. The students now attempt to solve the problem. And again, they're asked to solve it visually in as many different ways procedurally as they can, as well as be able to articulate it. As I was walking around, I noticed that there was one student only in the entire class that knew to turn the percentage into a decimal, as you can see here, and multiply. And I asked her, why are you doing that? And she couldn't explain why. She just said, I remembered it from last year. So she had a really good memory for those procedural understandings, or procedural knowledge, but she didn't actually understand. So this is what most of the students did. And they were allowed to use calculators because I wasn't specifically working on the skill of dividing by decimals, and I really wanted them to be solving the problem, not getting caught up in calculating. So they did this, and at this point, I knew it was time to intervene because there was no one who could successfully solve the problem and explain the solution. If there was, I would have asked them to come up after they shared with their group and present it to the class. So that's one of the ways to know when it's time to intervene is if a student can explain it, please let them explain it. But if there isn't anyone, then I knew that I had to jump in there. I will tell you though that this for me was a huge success. A student came up and said, okay, I tried this and I got this and I know this is wrong because it makes no sense given the problem. I can't tell you how often I see students in math class that are just calculating without any sense of whether it makes sense or not. They're not, conceptually understanding, but they're also not tuned in to what actually makes sense. They're just performing calculations. And so I love that she came up and knew that the answer was obviously wrong because it doesn't make any sense at all. So we celebrate those successes for sure. So now I knew it was time to revisit the meeting. So I put away that problem. We came back together. We got out the hundreds grids. I had a sense that this might happen. So I was ready for this. I knew that if they didn't understand how to find percentages of numbers, I was going to have to work through some sort of a model with them. So we went back to our base 10 blocks and our grids, and we were reminded that percent means out of 100. And then we used this model to figure out 20% of the cost of the chair. So you can see here that we have 100 squares, which total the entire price of the chair. So each little square would be about $1.40. I rounded. If this is totally new to you and you're looking at this model and thinking, what is she talking about? Check out our website, educatingnow.com. We have a video library that explains how to teach math conceptually for all of these concepts. So we use models like this as well as manipulatives so that students can actually make sense of what they're doing. So this is essentially what I gave them. So I didn't go into any huge long explanations. I didn't look at multiple ways of procedures yet. I just gave them this information. And then they went back to their teams to see if they could figure this out. And many of them immediately had an aha moment. They realized, oh, of course, I take the price of the chair and I could divide it into 100 pieces because percent means 100. And then I could figure out 20%. Now, I repeated this. We did quite a few more of these examples until the class understood it as a whole. So this is back to the teacher agility. I put aside the original problem for now, and I had to teach that missing or misremembered skill before continuing. And I didn't just want to give them the procedure because then they wouldn't have the deeper understanding that I'm looking for, right? That goal is conceptual understanding. And it will depend on your class. Sometimes this happens very quickly, and sometimes it takes a lot more time. So you need to adjust your practice based on that if you want to meet your learners' needs. So you have to walk away. I see a lot of teachers that have day plans yearly plans, and they know exactly what they're teaching each day of the year. And I'm in awe of the organization that would take. But my problem with that approach is every class is different, every student is different. And if you are not able to be flexible in how long things take, then you're not going to be meeting their needs. You're going to be losing kids. They're going to fall between the cracks. So we did more examples than just the one. And we didn't come back to the original problem actually until the next block. So we spent the rest of this day looking at how to find percentages of numbers. And most of the students really liked this way with the visual. It's not the most efficient way. So then I urged them to look for some more efficient ways. And what I found interesting actually was the traditional method of turning it into a decimal multiplying was the way that they least understood. Many of them it did not click. And that gave me a lot of information about their understanding of how decimals and fractions and percents are related. And I knew that that was something I was going to have to go back and revisit because they didn't have a good understanding. And so the following day, we returned back to the problem, and the students now have the skills and the understanding to solve which is the better coupon, $20 off or 20% off. And again, we encourage multiple pathways. Some of them actually turned 20% into a fraction, and they divided the cost of the chair into 5 pieces because 20% is a fifth. So there was all sorts of new learning that stemmed from that conceptual model that we started with.
Nikki, we've got one more question from the chat.
Sure.
Is there an ideal length of time for groups to work through problems in class?
Good question. And I talk a lot about this in the course. No, it depends on the class. So I had the opportunity to work in 6 different classes using this method, and ranging from grade 6, 7, 8 in French immersion classes and in English track classes. And it totally depended on the class itself. Some classes, it took 2 full blocks. Our blocks are 57 minutes to get through one problem. And again, at the beginning, the teacher was thinking, like, you're nuts, Nikki. This is going to take us forever just to get through one unit. But very quickly, the students began to work a lot faster. The slowing down is really getting them to gel as a group. And that takes the most time and effort for you as the teacher and for them as students. But my one advice is to give as much time as needed in order for them to not only solve the problem in all the multiple ways, but also to present. So I get as many different representations as I can up to present so that the students can see all of the different ways of solving. And that can take some time, but it's time well spent. And again, as you move forward, it starts to pick up quite quickly, but it does feel slow at the beginning. And the other suggestion, and again, this is all in the course, is to have some enrichment tasks. So this didn't happen very often, but in one class it did, where I had one team that was sort of just ahead of the rest of the group. They were quicker and they all were understanding it quite, deeply, but fast. And so I had an enrichment task, which was a similar or a parallel task that they could work on once they were finished, so that we weren't rushing the rest of the class. So back to this problem, what was interesting was at the very beginning when they made the predictions, there were a couple of students that realized that the $100 was sort of the magic number, and that 20% of 100 is $20. So if the price of the item was $100, then either the 20% or the $20 coupon would be the same. But if the prices are more than 100, the 20% off is a better deal. And really, when we look at the big idea of percentage, we want them to understand that it's proportional. And so that the higher the cost of the item, or the larger the number, the greater the percentage will be, even if it's still 20%. So next, I just want to discuss how this approach differentiates. And differentiating for math is definitely really challenging, more so than any other subject area that I've taught, in that it's so much more of a building subject. So it's really difficult to have a student working on, let's say, percentages if they don't have basic number skills and basic number sense. So this way, I found, just especially those struggling learners, it just skyrocketed them forward. And I think it's because they got the help that they needed as they needed it. And they were also constantly supported, encouraged, and taught by their peers. I also think that with some of those struggling learners, the reason that they were struggling was because they were opting out before. And now they weren't, I don't want to say allowed to, but they weren't. And the thing that these teams do that's beautiful is it utilizes peer pressure in a positive way. Because each one of them has a role and a responsibility, one of the roles of those kids is to make sure that every single person is contributing and is included. And so they have to ask open-ended questions and draw their peers into the conversation. So what happens is all of them are engaged, and those that are struggling are taught it in a way that makes sense to them. And sometimes it's at the most basic level and they don't understand the more sophisticated procedures, but that's okay as long as they understand the concept. Again, there's no opting out because they all have that role to play, and all students can participate even at a minimal level. So we tried this in a class where there were 4 students that had been pulled out for the rest of the year because their skills were so much lower than grade level, and they were working with a teacher who was helping them to build all those basic skills. And we put them into these groups among their peers. They weren't in a group themselves, they were interspersed. And one of the students has pretty severe learning difficulties. And she just wasn't up to the task of understanding, in this case, we were doing grade 8 algebra, to the level that her peers were, but she could participate because she always could find the patterns in the visuals. So even though she wasn't able at that time, and I think given more time, she could have been able to understand the higher level procedural methods, she certainly could identify patterns and she could participate. And I believe that having all students in there participating and learning is better than having them out doing some sort of individual practice or workbook on their own. And I will tell you that when one of my hesitations to doing this was, I had been a victim of group work throughout my schooling, in that I was the conscientious, hardworking one who ended up doing most of the work because I was so anxious about getting a good grade. And I didn't ever feel like it was a fair process. And that's why I love the way that we have the roles and the responsibilities, and that each person is responsible for themselves and each other's learning, because it eliminates that. But my other concern was I was worried about those quote unquote strong students, because I didn't want them to always be in the role of teacher, because I thought that's not fair to them. They should be challenged at a greater depth. And what I realized is that they are challenged at a greater depth, because most of those quote unquote strong students are strong procedurally. And even if they are strong conceptually, their challenge is to explain in multiple different ways. And that really does challenge them, because I found a lot of them really struggled with the visuals. And the cool thing was that the struggling learners often get the visuals and they get to be the expert and teach the stronger students about what they understand. So it really allowed for every student to be a star in their own right. And I found that really, really inspiring and really powerful. What I saw with those students was that they developed deeper conceptual understanding, especially when they had to look at it visually. I love this visual. It's the equal versus fair argument. So you can see here when we give all three of these little guys the same box, two of them can see the game, but one can't. So when we look at differentiating, it's that the idea that we're not going to do the same thing for every student. That's not what we mean by fair. What we mean by fair is that every student gets what they need in order to learn. And from what I experienced in all of these classrooms, this way really did a beautiful job of that. Okay, so let's sum it up. And I'm going to give you one more reminder that our course goes into all of this in way more detail. There's 12 modules, so it breaks down everything I've done here into kind of the nitty-gritty detail, as well as giving you some resources. So what we saw, when I say we, it's the teachers that I had the opportunity to collaborate with. We saw students were engaged. We saw positive peer pressure was helping to motivate students to continue engaging and learning. We all know that success breeds success. As soon as they're getting the support they need and they're understanding the math, they're far more motivated to continue learning, and we see more of that learning happening. We see students are learning important skills, more so than just math skills, such as the communication, collaboration, problem solving, at the same time as learning math. And that's what I love, is it intertwines them beautifully. If you're a teacher in BC, like myself, you'll see that in the new curriculum. There are the curricular competencies alongside the content, and these math teams interweave those beautifully in a way of then reaching those big ideas. We are using challenging problems that can be solved in multiple ways, and teachers intervene only when needed. So allow them the opportunity to struggle and fail and actually do some authentic problem solving. And the other thing we notice is it meets way more of the students' needs. It's the best way I've seen to differentiate. And I've been working on this for years. Like I said before, I've been trying to, use manipulatives and partner talk and all sorts of other methods to develop deeper conceptual understanding. And these teams utilize all those practices and adds the added support of being in a team. Now, don't expect it all to go super smoothly right away. Just like adults who start working in teams, the kids go through all sorts of norming and storming phases. So you will definitely need to be patient, and I'll see if we have any more questions here. If you felt that this webinar was useful as a beginning point, or some of you might already have been jumping into using Math Teams and this might just help give you a refresher, then please like us on Facebook, share your thoughts on Twitter. We would love to spread the word and have more people engaging in these types of practices so that students have better opportunities to love math. Now, you will be getting an email shortly after this webinar is finished. And right now, our Collaborative Learning Teams course only has 2 of the modules that are ready to go. 4 are in production, and the rest are still being, haven't been filmed yet. So we are offering people the opportunity to enroll for only 25% of the original price. So that's 75% off. So for $62.25, you can enroll now, and you will have access to all the modules. And each time we add modules, that price goes up. So we'll be sending you a link that you can click on, and it will look just like this. And you'll have a week to think about it and activate it to get this price. And the price will go up after that week. So once you click on it, you'll see how you create an account. We just need name, email, password, and then it will show up as your coupon discount. You can enter your method of payment, and that is it. You will be ready to start with the course. And the course is really comprehensive. It's designed to give you everything you need to get going. Here is the outline. So even the getting started, there's 2 parts. There's a whole section on building the culture, and I give a lot of examples of the tasks I used and the sheets that we developed and so on. So I've just briefly touched on these things today because I didn't want to talk at you for 10 hours. So hopefully you are inspired to give this a try. And if you want to learn more, please sign up for our course. I am going to come off of screen share now. Okay. Do we have any other questions, Hugo or Lou?
For the moment, we're good.
Okay.
No questions yet.
Great. So please feel free, if you are jumping into this and you have questions along the way, please feel free to email and contact us at Educating Now and check out that course in more detail. And please like and share us as we get closer to the school year. We're hoping to do a few more webinars and get more teachers on board with giving this powerful way of teaching a try. Thanks for joining us today.